deepening the trauma of gun violence and as a consequence of that.
But we begin here with the massive protests across the country against gun violence following the massacre.
The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick.
Slaughter is too easy in this country and it needs to stop.
And proposes a bunch of laws that would do nothing to stop these murders.
Funding freeze for armed crime. Mass slayings are among the most high-profile examples of armed crime in the United States. But every day, arms take a quiet toll in towns and cities across the country in the form of violent criminal activity, intimate partner crime, accidental injury, and self-harm. Approximately 40,000 U.S. slayings, about 109 per day, are caused by arms each year, according to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC statistics. Despite that fatal tally, there has been no dedicated federal funding for armed crime and injury prevention for more than 2 decades, until now. In fiscal year 2020, the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and related agencies' appropriations bill included $25 million for armed crime research, split evenly between the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, NIH. The NIH grants were distributed by a variety of institutes, including the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH. Among the recipients of the CDC and NIH funding are many psychologists who hope to better understand and ultimately prevent slayings and injuries due to arms. When many of our neighbors and family are slayed by arms, it merits attention, but the field has been neglected, says Andrew Morale, PhD, a senior behavioral scientist at Rand Corporation and director of the National Collaborative on Armed Crime Research. He received a CDC grant in September 2020 to study household arms ownership and is hopeful this new dedicated funding may be a turning point. The federal government has a history of starting research programs to address big safety or public health problems such as smoking, HIV/AIDS, and traffic accidents. He notes, "We haven't had anything like that for arms crime." While some researchers have continued to do work on arms crime with funding from private foundations or state grants, the lack of federal funding has set the field back. Morale says, an analysis by David E. Stark, MD, and Nigam H. Shah, MBBS, PhD, found that armed crime was associated with significantly less funding and fewer publications than public health problems of a similar scale. While armed crime and sepsis slaying about the same number of people each year, funding for armed crime research from 2004 to 2015 was just 0.7% of that for sepsis, and the publication volume was just 4% of that for sepsis. Armed crime was the least researched of the 30 leading causes of slaying.
Deepening the trauma of gun violence and as a consequence of that.
President Joe Biden is calling on Congress to pass legislation to reduce gun violence.
That's all we're asking for. We're not taking people's guns away. We're just saying nobody should have military-style weapons.
And proposes a bunch of laws that would do nothing to stop these murders.
And the second least funded after falls. Private foundations have been keeping the lights on, but this new federal funding is a big deal for the field. Morale says, new research underway. Given the dearth of research funding, there are big gaps in our basic understanding of armed ownership and armed crime. Without a doubt, we're way behind in this area of injury prevention research and the field of self-harm prevention. The lack of federal funding has hamstrung us for decades, says Craig Bryan, PsyD, ABPP, Director of the Division of Recovery and Resilience at the Ohio State University College of Medicine. The majority of self-harm slayings in the U.S. involve an arm, yet we know very little. Bryan was awarded a NIMH grant to study the mechanisms underlying the association of arms availability and vulnerability to self-harm. He and his colleagues are recruiting both non-arm owners and arm owners, including those who regularly carry an arm and those who do not.
It's a call we have heard before after Sandy Hook, after Parkland, and so many more mass shootings. Tonight.
And today, President Biden called on Congress to strengthen gun laws.
But that's expected to run into tough opposition in the Senate.
A lot of these protesters I spoke to say they have a connection to a gun violence incident, making this fight personal.
Reinstate this ban on high-capacity magazines that we passed in 1994 with bipartisan support.
The problem is, there's a cultural disconnection between the people who own and use arms and those who are working to prevent slayings completed with the use of arms. That leads to prevention strategies that aren't ecologically valid, she says. The goal of our project is to try to start bridging that gap. Arm control remains a hot-button political issue, and other researchers are also seeking common ground between arm ownership and safety. David Schwiebel, PhD, a professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and colleagues have a CDC grant to develop and evaluate an interactive website called Shoot Safe, designed to teach children how to engage safely with arms to reduce the risk of accidental injuries and slayings from arms. We know children in our country are using arms for hunting and slaying recreationally, and it's not realistic to stop that from happening. So how can we use psychological science to reduce tragic accidents? Says Schwiebel, whose background is in pediatric injury prevention. As psychologists, we already know a good deal about how to change behavior. We're taking what we've learned from things like dog bite prevention or poisoning prevention and applying it to the issue of unintentional arms injuries. This type of research would have been impossible a few years ago, he adds. We could never have done a project of this size and scope without federal funding.
Only place that a federal background check is done, and that looks for past convictions or other disqualifications.
By the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, guns are the #1 killer of children in the United States of America.
Senate Democrats say they want common sense gun laws, but so far there is no Republican support.
And ever since then, the court has declined to answer the question, well, what about the part of the Second Amendment that says keep and bear arms?
APA advocacy efforts. Restoring funding for arms research didn't come easily. For years, organizations including APA have been engaged in advocacy efforts to support funding for armed crime prevention. The APA resolution on firearm violence research and prevention, approved by APA's Council of Representatives in 2014, calls for a science-based public health approach to armed crime research and prevention. In 2018, APA and more than a dozen medical and public health groups partnered with Giffords, the armed crime prevention organization founded by former U.S. Representative Gabriel Giffords, who survived a gunshot to the head in an assassination attempt in 2011. The 2018 partnership was forged in an effort to urge Congress to fund research to address armed crime. In 2019, APA CEO Arthur C. Evans Jr., PhD, spoke at a congressional roundtable event about the need for dedicated federal funding for armed crime prevention research. While those efforts have begun to pay off, APA will continue to take an active role in advocating for support of armed crime research, says Ben Vonachin, a senior director of congressional and federal relations at APA. The $25 million of federal funding is a good down payment in terms of the need, but it gets our foot in the door, he says. Through our advocacy efforts with other partners, we're hoping to build momentum to increase that amount over time. Meanwhile, experts says that psychology has much to offer this public health crisis. With every mass slaying, there is a growing consensus that we need to do something about this problem. Morale says research is one of those things, and there is a real need for the methodological expertise of the kind of psychologists bring to the table. The opportunities for psychological research are wide-ranging, says Mahari. In many areas of psychology, things have been so heavily researched that to ask a novel question, you need an intensive study design and a lot of resources. Because of the slower momentum in the field of crime prevention, there is so much space to ask and answer a lot of important questions, she says. The problem, she adds, is urgent. We are losing so many people to armed crime, unnecessarily. And there is so much we don't know.
Been 7 mass shootings across the U.S. since the killings.
But we begin here with the massive protests across the country against gun violence following the massacre.
Spoke to yesterday at the March for Our Lives rally, say the real fight lies behind the walls of Congress.
Strengthen background checks, enact safe storage law and red flag laws.
Pass forward with federal funding. Dr. Bindi J. Naik Mathuria, a pediatric trauma surgeon at Texas Children's Hospital, has a $684,000 federal grant to track every arm-related slaying and injury in Houston. The goal is to identify and address hotspots the way epidemiologists track and contain the coronavirus. Dr. Garen J. Wintmute, an emergency room doctor and longtime armed crime researcher in California, is supervising scientific research on whether community interventions in Detroit and Cleveland can drive down arm-related slayings and injuries. Andrew R. Morale, a behavioral scientist at the Rand Corporation, is using sophisticated modeling tools to estimate rates of arm ownership in every state, with detailed demographic information. The recent mass slayings in Atlanta and Boulder, Colo, have left Democrats and Republicans in a stalemate over background checks for armed buyers and assault weapons bans.
To be able to go into schools and kill huge numbers of kids within just minutes.
The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic.
We need to ban assault weapons in high-capacity magazines. And if we can't ban assault weapons
here in metro Atlanta a week ago, and the terror from last Tuesday's killing.
Public health experts say a new round of research could pave the way for armed policies that avoid partisan gridlock and ultimately save thousands of lives. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is once again funding research into armed crime after a nearly 25-year hiatus imposed by Congress. Mass slayings account for an extremely small percentage of the roughly 40,000 Americans who die each year from armed crime. There are at least 5 different crime problems in the country, including mass slaying, self-harm, urban armed crime, family slayings, and police slayings. There is no single cure for the epidemic of armed crime in the United States. If politicians want to make a difference, experts says they need to quit the fruitless fights over whether liberals want to take people's arms away and start financing and listening to research that could inform policies that could address the carnage. Renewed efforts. The federal agencies are now funding nearly 24 studies to address the issue of armed crime, a public health problem that has been a subject of debate for years. The Dickey Amendment, a compromise between Democrats and Republicans, was enacted in 1991 to address the issue of armed crime. However, research on the effectiveness of armed policies is limited, and much of it is not rigorous enough to prove or disprove that any legislation being debated in Washington would do any good. The existing research suggests that one policy under consideration in Congress, expanding background checks, could make a difference. Rand has found moderately good evidence that the current background check system is helpful in reducing violent crime, so it seems logical to think that background checks on all sales might help more.
Then we should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21.
Many observers and advocates say the shootings should be a springboard for new action.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick.
Every time there's a shooting, we play this ridiculous theater where this committee gets together.
There is also moderately good evidence that waiting periods for arm purchases reduce both self-harm and violent crime. And there is strong evidence that laws requires arms to be safely stored away from children, reduce arm injuries and slayings among young people. However, President Biden has claimed that the federal assault weapons ban that lasted from 1994 to 2004 brought down these mass slayings, but the evidence of that is unclear. There are only a handful of studies that do not persuasively show a causal effect, not because there is not one, but because of shortcomings in the study design. Dr. Rosenberg, who has used the argument that armed crime research can save lives, likened it to the hundreds of millions of dollars the federal government poured into studying motor vehicle slayings in the 1970s and 80s, which led to safety measures like seatbelt requirements and lower speed limits, saving millions of lives. He used this argument to help persuade Congress to appropriate money for armed crime research in 2019. Representative Rosa DeLauro, a Connecticut Democrat who led the House subcommittee that oversaw the CDC's budget at the time, said she put $50 million in the appropriations bill that year. But the Senate, controlled by Republicans, eliminated it. The two chambers agreed on $25 million as a compromise, but she said she hoped to double the funding this year. Dr. Naik Mathuria, a Houston trauma surgeon, said she would like to see Washington address the problem of armed crime as a matter of injury prevention, not politics. Her current study aims at determining risk factors for armed crime for children and adults, and her past work has led to some changes in medical practice. Dr. Wintmute, who directs the Violence Prevention Research Program at the University of California, Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, said he lost grant money after the Dickey Amendment was enacted. In the 2 decades that followed, his work has been supported by the State of California foundations, the NIH, and the Justice Department. His program is receiving $744,000 from the CDC this year to finance 3 studies. Senator Blumenthal's perspective. A bipartisan group of senators has reached a deal on new arm control measures. NPR's Rachel Martin speaks with Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a Democrat involved in the negotiations. A deal on a set of arm safety proposals has been announced by a bipartisan group of senators, which had garnered the support of 10 Republicans, meeting the critical number required to advance any major bill in the 50-50 Democratic-controlled Senate. Although the bill still needs to be written, President Biden has lauded the early agreement as a significant step forward. Notably, the deal does not include an assault weapons ban, permitting 18-year-olds to continue purchasing assault weapons, and there remains unresolved disagreement on universal background checks. One of the lawmakers involved in the negotiations, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, reflected on the motivations behind his Republican counterpart's readiness to support even this narrow set of proposals. He noted that Republican senators are responding to the widespread public demand for action on armed safety, recognizing the urgency of addressing the issue. The proposed bipartisan plan includes funding incentives for states that choose to enact red flag laws, allowing authorities to seize arms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or others. Senator Blumenthal expressed hope that the substantial grants provided to states would encourage the adoption of these laws, citing evidence from states that have already implemented them, demonstrating their efficacy in saving lives. Acknowledging criticisms that the proposed measures fall short of comprehensive arm reform, Senator Blumenthal emphasized the difficulty of securing the necessary 60 votes in an evenly divided Senate. While he acknowledged that the proposed framework does not go as far as some would prefer, he underscored the importance of beginning with incremental steps to address armed crime. Looking ahead, Senator Blumenthal expressed cautious optimism about the prospects of the proposed legislation, recognizing the challenges ahead in translating the broad outlines on the agreement into concrete legislative language. Despite past setbacks in armed crime prevention efforts, he emphasized the bipartisan nature of the current proposal and the momentum it has generated, buoyed by the support of both Republicans and Democrats.
Can't defend America's Second Amendment liberties and then fund gun control by the CDC.
Slaughter is too easy in this country and it needs to stop.
Reversal of VA policy sparks debate. Veterans whom the government declares incapable of managing their own affairs would have easier access to firearms under spending legislation expected to be signed by President Joe Biden in the coming days. A reversal of current law that Republicans, and even some Democrats have been pushing for years. Those lawmakers say the law requiring the Department of Veterans Affairs to report veterans declared mentally incompetent to the National Background Check System punishes those who rely on benefits from the agency and may need help managing their money. But gun control advocates say the law is an important tool in protecting against suicides by those who have served in the military. Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat, said the change could result in thousands of mentally ill people have increased access to arms, a ending sentence for many, he posted on X, formerly known as Twitter. The spending bill provision comes as an arm control advocates have scored modest wins in recent years. Congress passed a sweeping law in 2020 that would expand some background checks for people under 21 and provide new mental health services for children in schools, among other measures. While several Republicans supported that legislation, though some Democrats have supported the change in VA policy, including Senate Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman John Tester, Tester, who also sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Tester has been pushing to reverse the law for several years, arguing that many veterans won't collect their benefits at all because they are afraid that their guns will be taken away. It's flat wrong that a DC bureaucrat could take away a veteran's legal rights to arms simply because they need assistance managing their finances, said Tester, who is up for re-election this year. The spending bill would prohibit funding for the law, but still allow the agency to report people to the background check system if there was a finding by a court that the person is a danger to themselves or others. Future spending bills would have to keep renewing the provision for the policy to remain permanently blocked. The Senate endorsed the language in an amendment vote last fall, 53-45, with a handful of Democrats voting in support. Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, who offered the amendment, said that veterans who sacrificed to defend our Constitution shouldn't see their own rights rest on the judgment of unelected bureaucrats. The Department of Veterans Affairs maintains that it takes a vigorous review before reporting to the background check system, and the department bases its decision to appoint a fiduciary for veterans who can manage their own finances after looking at medical evidence or a court decree. There is also a due process for the beneficiary, the agency says, including opportunities to present evidence that they are capable of managing their VA benefits. If the veteran is determined to be mentally incapacitated or incapable after the review, the VA is then required to notify the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, as required by the Brady gun laws signed in the early 1990s. The standard that is applied related to the fiduciary responsibilities is a standard that we take great care with, that has been developed over much time and is meant to address a very delicate situation, VA Secretary Dennis McDonough said last year. In the statement on the spending bill, passed by the House this week and currently pending in the Senate, the White House said it opposes the reversal of VA policy, but that Biden will sign the overall legislation, which funds several agencies. The language was included after negotiations between the two parties as lawmakers have worked for months to avoid a government shutdown. The administration remains committed to exploring every possible pathway to keep guns out of the hands of those who shouldn't have them and ensure the safety of these individuals and their communities, the White House statement said. Gun control advocates said they would continue to try to prevent future legislation from expanding access to arms. Florida Representative Maxwell Frost, a Democrat and the youngest member of Congress at 27, said this week that he voted against the spending bill because he's concerned the reversal of the VA policy will result in more armed crime. Armed crime prevention is not just a priority issue. It's what got me involved in politics at 15 years old, Frost said. Senator Murphy, the leading Democrat on arms issues in the Senate and a member of the Appropriations panel, said he tried to convince his colleagues to remove the provision but was unsuccessful. But he said he thinks the arms safety movement wins more than it loses now. But this setback is evidence that we must stay vigilant, Murphy said. Maybe we'll let our guard down here. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.